Thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be speaking in the seminar series. I have very fond memories of having visited Sweden a couple of times in the past 10 years. Once in January when it was very cold and dark, but still very wonderful. Okay, so this seminar will be about this paper, The Unequal Impact of Parenthood in Academia. And I want to start by highlighting the fact that this is a very old topic that people have been looking at for a very long time. A seminal paper by Colin Zuckerman in 1984 called The Productivity Puzzle, it coined that term, considered this question of the gendered productivity gap between male scientists and female scientists. And so this was, almost 40 years ago when this paper was written. And this paper itself references 50 past studies showing that women publish less than men in science. And it claims that these patterns are stable going all the way back to the 1920s. They used a clever approach of a match pair design of early career researchers, and they found essentially that women are cited equally paper for paper, but they just write fewer papers. And so by coining this term, the productivity puzzle, they really sort of collected attention around this idea and focused it on trying to explain this particular phenomenon. In our data, which we'll talk about quite a bit later, we find exactly this pattern as well. So here we'll be looking at 3 different fields focused mainly on United States faculty. I recognize that the audience here is not as United States focused as my usual audience is. And so at various points, I'll make connections with the data and the results that we know that hold in Europe as well. So here we're looking at computer science, business, and history. These are tenure track professors at R1 or research intensive universities in the US. And we find that indeed, we have a significant productivity gap that emerges between men and women in each of these 3 fields, all always in the same direction. It varies in magnitude in part because the sort of natural scale of productivity also varies across fields. In computer science, we write a lot of papers, and so the gap is far bigger. In history, it's focused mostly on monographs and a few articles, and so the gap is smaller because the overall productivity level is lower. Okay. So over these 40 years of consideration of this problem, there has been a lot of different hypotheses advanced to explain the origins of this pattern. And one is institutional factors, in which, for instance, if the distribution of men and women who are publishing papers is different across the research intensity of institutions, such that perhaps women tend to be at less research intensive institutions, then you would naturally expect to see a gap in publishing, simply because the men are more likely to be at places where they focus on publishing more. So it may be that institutional factors explain the emergence and persistence of this gap. It could also be teaching and service work, in the sense that several studies have noted that women tend to do greater teaching and greater amounts of service than men do. And so from a perspective of just time being available to conduct research, this would tend to reduce the productivity by reducing the amount of time that women have available to do the research relative to their male colleagues. Another possibility, which has been explored, is that it's differences in research specializations. That if men naturally choose research specializations with higher productivity levels, like for instance, they tend to go into computer science as opposed to history, at least at the field level, then we would naturally see that the men who are in the more productive specializations would write more papers because that's normal for them. And if women are in specializations that tend to write fewer papers, then the gap would emerge, not because of individual differences in the sense of males and females, men and women, but rather because the norms of the fields that they naturally tend to find themselves working in. And so these are different explanations for the distribution of people and how they allocate their time. There may also be biases in peer review. If, for instance, it takes less time to get a paper published if you're a man, because there's less bias in the system, you have fewer rejections, the peer reviews are less thorny or insulting, then your productivity should increase because you spend less time writing each paper and getting it published. It could also be that, I love this paper, that women are just more careful with their writing and they take more time to revise and to refine their arguments, not because they're being forced to by peer reviewers, but because they care about the quality of writing. And men, they just bang out the next thing and send it off. And so that would naturally also create a difference in overall productivity because the men are writing a larger quantity of perhaps lower quality articles, while the women are writing a lower quantity but higher quality articles. Another possibility is that career lengths are different, that if women have shorter career lengths on average, then they will naturally tend to produce fewer papers because they have fewer years of that production. And then finally, there's also parenthood, which is sort of an obvious gender difference that in most cultures, women spend more time than men attending to and raising children. All of these things have been introduced and explored empirically and theoretically as explanations of why there is this persistent productivity gap between men and women. We're going to focus on parenthood in this talk. And even here, the past work is quite mixed, which I think is very interesting, considering that any of us who have children, my children will appear later in this talk, we have this very visceral, intense experience, which we know that having kids changes the allocation of your work time and your productivity. But in fact, the results of parenthood, and in fact, any explanation for the publishing gap, they depend on discipline and institution and even country. And they rarely consider things that seem obvious and important, like the year of the child's birth. When does the event happen in which parenthood appears? And they don't account for trends in individual productivity. For instance, some people may be on an upward trend or a downward trend, and then an event happens. And so you have to measure the impact relative to what that person was doing just before they had the child. So let's give some examples of the mixture of this work. Here are some papers that indicate that parenthood produces a negative effect on your productivity. And I want to highlight the fact that there are two papers in this group of four that were done in European nations. So there's one in German sociology, and then another looking at ecology in France and Norway. And here they find that even in places where you have strong social support systems like paid parental leave, that there is still a gendered effect on productivity. The paper on France and Norway is quite interesting. It sort of identifies a number of cultural factors too that may be at play between the French system and the Norwegian system. There are even papers that find a positive impact of having kids, which might be counterintuitive if you have kids, but there are a number of them that also find no effect. So they're unable to identify a statistical effect in either direction. And so considering this body of research that suggests that there are a large number of possible explanations and the evidence in each direction is somewhat mixed, it's understandable why this puzzle has remained a puzzle for so long. But then COVID happened, and many, many articles were written about the gendered effect of parenthood on scientists, in part because there was this sort of global shock to the scientific community in which people radically reallocated their time as in response to an external stimulus. Most of these articles are about United States scientists, but not all of them. But they all point to the fact that when women have increased responsibilities outside the workplace, that tends to decrease the time that they spend producing research in terms of, for instance, posting preprints on preprint servers, submitting manuscripts, returning reviews requested by journals, publishing papers, et cetera, et cetera. All of these things have been measured as being impacted specifically for women as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. Okay, so there have been hundreds of papers written about this topic. I gave you sort of a sampling of some of the explanations that have been given, but they all find ubiquitous evidence of a gap. I know of not a single paper that conclusively shows that there's no gender difference in productivity. So it's very easy to find evidence of this effect, but there are many, many plausible explanations. And each of the papers that investigates one of those plausible explanations, of course, is likely to find some evidence in favor of their favored new explanation. So if they focus on a question of the quality of writing, like they published a paper on it, so they find some evidence about quality of writing. And so it seems clear that there are a multiplicity of factors that influence this pattern, but there are also many confounding factors because most of these studies only measure a small number of the variables that we might imagine are causally related to the effect itself. And then there's this complicating factor of generational inertia in the sense that even the gender composition of the scientific workforce has changed enormously in the past 40 years. The oldest cohort of professors has a very different gender distribution in terms of men and women than the youngest cohort of professors. generally women's share of the scientific workforce is increasing. And that naturally should create changes in culture and trends and norms and policies that may also interact with the productivity puzzle. For parenthood specifically, a complicating factor is that children occur at different times in a career. If you have a child while you're a graduate student versus a postdoc versus a junior professor versus a tenured professor, the impact of that child on your productivity may be different in each of those cases. And that makes it more complicated to measure a sort of a clean signal in terms of what is the impact of having children on men and women scientists. And of course, the impact of children changes as the children themselves change in their age. In the first few years of their life, they're very intense. I have a 17-month-old here, and wow, you spend all your time chasing after them, making sure they're not going to kill themselves. Whereas as they get older, my 9-year-old, for instance, she's much more self-sufficient and requires less sort of, keeping her alive by preventing her from sticking her fingers in the electrical socket and stuff like that. But the sort of the time that you spend as a parent changes. And so that also changes how you can allocate your time to research. But the punchline for all of these things is that it's really hard to get the right data to construct an identification strategy, support it with data, and then identify the causal impact of one of these factors. It's just hard. So our study design to try to solve this puzzle was to combine information, the right information, we hope, about the timing of parenthood, so the specific year in which a person had their child, relative to their own year, their age in terms of their career and their calendar age, and also compare that with productivity over time. So we actually want to track individual productivity, number of papers published over time, and then line that up with an event of parenthood, and then look at what happens afterwards. And we're also going to consider leave policies. So I mentioned that this study is mostly focused on US faculty, where parental leave policies are typically at the institution level as opposed to at the national level. And the advantage for science is that this gives us some ability to measure the impact of differences in leave policies. If there was a single national leave policy that applied to all of these individuals, it would be harder to measure any kind of an impact for the leave policies. Okay, so our study design, we're going to use a survey in order to obtain the timing of parenthood information. The productivity information we're going to get from bibliometric databases like Web of Science, or even their CVs. We're just going to look at their CV and see what they say they did. This is sort of objective data in the sense that we can count it very cleanly and it's publicly available because most academics are pretty good about putting their CV online and we can find it that way. But the timing of parenthood, most faculty in the US at least do not include the year of birth of their children on their CV. And so this is not public information. So the survey allows us to ask people to tell us what year their children were born in. So in this case, we did a large survey of these three fields: computer science, history, and business. We focused on tenure track faculty at research intensive institutions. These are places that grant PhDs. And this is important because it controls for one of those confounding variables that I mentioned earlier, the differences in institutions. Because if it's the case that we surveyed, all computer scientists, well, some computer scientists are at institutions that are not as research intensive. And so naturally their productivity should be lower. And if the rate of being a male or a female at those institutions, a man or a woman at those institutions, is higher to be a woman at a less research intensive institution, then that will introduce a bias or confound in our analysis. So we're going to focus on people who essentially have the same job and the same job responsibilities, people whose job it is to produce research mostly. So we had a pretty good response rate as these things go, about 17.5%, which gave us about 3,000 responses to analyze. We're going to combine those 3,000 responses with individual level productivity counts. So we went and looked at these people's CVs and counted how many papers they published over their career. We counted published books and published papers. So we dropped things like blog posts and prospective essays and things like that that did not sort of represent the same level of research commitment and time intensity as a regular academic article or book would require. And then we also looked at the institutions themselves, so where it was that these people worked. So we have a prestige ranking, so how prestigious is each department in its field. And then we hand collected the parental leave policies for a large fraction, about half of these particular institutions. And let me tell you, that was a lot of very painful work to read through these faculty handbooks and try to parse exactly what the heck these policies really meant. And I'll come back to that theme a little bit later to discuss what we learned from that. Okay, so this is our study design. The goal is basically to get the right data, to set up a causal identification strategy, and then measure the impact of parenthood directly. So first, let's start off with some summary statistics about what we found. So the first is that academia is really a family business. Most faculty who are age 40 and above, so essentially beyond their new childbearing years, 71% of women and 82% of men have children, at least one. So most faculty at the US institutions at least have children. 39%, this was a shocking statistic for me, 39% had their first child before their first faculty job. So they're having their first kid while they're a graduate student or a postdoc prior to becoming faculty. And this was shocking to me in part because, at least in the US, there's this sort of parable or myth that many people wait until they get tenure before they begin having a family, because the bar for getting tenure is so intimidating and they feel like they don't have time to devote to having a family. And so therefore they focus on getting that tenure achievement first, and then they can relax and start having a family. In fact, we find that at least on average, that's not the case at all, because 39% have their first child before their first faculty job. The average age of their first child is 33. It's the same for men and women. Compared with the US population in general, it's quite a big delay for women and a less large delay for men, a little bit of a delay. And I want to point out that the difference between 26 for women and 33 for women for the US population and faculty who have kids is roughly the length of a PhD and maybe a year of postdoc. We also find that parents are not more or less likely to be at higher low prestige institutions. There's another myth that when you're faculty at a place like MIT or Stanford or Harvard, these pressure cooker type environments with extremely high expectations for productivity, that maybe there are fewer children there, or there's less probability of becoming a parent. And we find that that's simply not the case. The parents are everywhere sort of in terms of the prestige hierarchy in sort of equal rates. And the average number of children is pretty close to what the average is for the US population, 1.8 for women and 2.2 for men. So we don't actually see a lot of differences in terms of childbearing behavior relative to the general population, with the exception of the age at which they have their first child, which is delayed by a significant fraction. Okay, so our causal inference setup is going to use this technique called comparative interrupted time series. And this is a matched pair design in which we choose a parent and a non-parent in order to be able to contrast the productivity difference between these two classes prior to an event happening. And then we measure the difference in their behavior after the event, but we want to control for the expected change. So we use the change that we see in the untreated category, the non-parent, as a baseline expectation of change for the parent after the event. And then we measure the difference between what the parent actually does and what we counterfactually expect them to do. And that's the effect size. And so let me just walk through the way we construct that with parents and non-parents, because we have to assign counterfactual children in order to do this. So what we're going to do is we're going to create these matched pairs by matching on the same year of birth so that we can control for some cohort effects. We're going to match on discipline, so not matching computer scientists with historians, but only computer scientists with computer scientists. And of course, we're going to match on gender in order to control that effect. And then we're going to assign a counterfactual child to the non-parent, as this is when we would expect that change to happen. And that's how we're going to measure that delta. And here we tried a number of different fancy techniques, regression techniques, et cetera, to try to build a model that would tell us, given your characteristics, your productivity behavior, your institutional affiliation, et cetera, how can we predict distribution for when this counterfactual child would have happened had this non-parent had decided to have a child? And what we found is that none of these fancy models was really good. All of our robustness and validation checks showed that they perform no better than simply choosing from the empirical distribution of year of first births among the parents. And so that's exactly what we do in the end. We say, given this empirical distribution centered at 33 years, we're just going to assign a counterfactual child drawn IID from this empirical distribution. And then we're going to measure the publications per year for the 5 years preceding the child, and then for the 10 years after the child. So this gives us our pre-treatment and our post-treatment periods. And then we can measure the lift in terms of the effect size there. Okay, so let's look at the data in detail for computer science. Here I've split out the men and women, and I've also split out within the gender category, the with children and without children. Here we're just looking at time prior to having the child. So the 0 mark here on the plots is when the child is born, counterfactual child for the non-parents, and actual child that we got from the survey for the parents. And we already see something surprising, which also connects with and explains something that we have seen previously in the literature. You may notice that the solid circles here are the productivity values of people who later become parents. And those individuals are already more productive than their future non-parent partners, partners in terms of the matching. And so this is surprising that we see a difference in productivity in the opposite direction that you might expect between parents and non-parents prior to there being a child at all. We don't think this is some sort of like backward causality kind of effect in which people are planning their productivity, anticipating some sort of impact. Like, if I know I'm going to have kids 5 years from now, I better be ultra productive for those 5 years so that I can soak up any kind of a shock that might happen to my productivity. We don't think that's likely because that's just not how academia works, right? It's extremely hard to ramp up your productivity by almost a full paper a year and sustain that for 5 years just because you know that you're going to have a kid in the future. Like, if you have that flexibility, why wouldn't the people who don't have parents do that too? Because there's clearly an incentive for them doing that. They're rewarded in part based on their productivity. So I'll talk more about that in a moment, this weird effect. But what we see is that this difference between the productivity of parents and non-parents, with parents being more productive, it may explain why in some previous studies of the impact of parenthood, they find either no effect or a positive effect of being parents. Because there are differences in productivity between parents and non-parents, even prior to having the kids. And so if you're not able to align those productivity trajectories based on when the kid occurs, it seems possible that you would get a confound by having the non-parents lower productivity end up sort of implying that there's a positive impact for parenthood. Okay, enough setup. I know you want to see what happens after the child is born. What we find is a big difference between men and women. The women's productivity drops relative to where they would have been in the counterfactual event of having no child. And essentially their productivity moves from being higher than the non-parents to being roughly the same as the non-parents. And so that counts as a shock to their productivity. And we see no such shock for the men. Now, I want to point out that these are averages that we're plotting here. And so the fact that the means are the same for the women is very informative. But the fact that the means are different from the men doesn't mean that every man experiences no shock or boost to their productivity. It just means that on average, those shocks and boosts cancel out to give you sort of no effect at all. So what we find is that women's publication rate experiences a substantial negative shock associated with the event of having a child. The shock is about a minus 17% annual productivity for computer science, minus 24% for business, and a minus 48% for history. I'll show you the business and history plots on the next slide. Men's publication rate, we find generally no shock. And that, in my interpretation, implies that the positive shocks, in the sense of perhaps the man takes parental leave, doesn't do much work in terms of raising the children, and writes a bunch more papers. For instance, I know several individuals in computer science personally who have taken that strategy to use the leave that they're granted for children to write more papers. And that the frequency of those positive shocks sort of equals the frequency and magnitude of the negative shocks of people who take parental leave, for instance, and actually reduce their productivity. I've taken parental leave 3 times for my 3 daughters, and each time I wrote a lot fewer papers during that time. So I certainly would be on the negative shock side, but that just implies that there is somebody on the other side, positive benefit, who canceled me out in terms of the overall average. We find that the shock is greatest in history, minus 48% is pretty astounding, really. And our hypothesis here is that perhaps it's related to collaboration norms, in the sense that computer science is a lab-driven or lab-focused field in which faculty like myself have groups of students that work with us. And as a result, I can, if I'm reducing my individual productivity because I have a child to care for, my students or the co-authors can sort of pick up the slack to some degree, whereas history is more of an individualistic structured field in which people write monographs and solo author papers. And so as a result, if you have less time to devote to research, then your productivity decreases because there's no one else there to support it. So this is a hypothesis. We're interested in exploring that in the future to understand to what degree do these field level norms in terms of collaboration patterns influence the shape of these kinds of impacts on productivity. The computer science shock is enormous, in part because our productivity is really high too. It accounts for essentially 17.6 fewer papers written by mothers compared to fathers over the 10 years after the child's birth. And that's essentially a 5-year productivity gap. And I mean that if the men stopped writing papers for 5 years, then the women would catch up, essentially. So it's truly enormous. If we look at the plots for business and history, they're messier in part because the productivity scale is lower, but the CITS analysis allows us to pick out the coefficients that tell you what the slopes of these lines, and that's what gives us the overall pattern. Okay, so now I want to turn and ask a different question. So we've looked at the productivity patterns and the impact of childhood, but let's also ask about things like parental leave policies. In the US, these things are institution specific. Sometimes there's influence at the state level in which a state may have introduced its own sort of sub-policy relative to the nation, but for the most part, things vary quite a bit across institutions. And so we want to ask the question of what role does paid parental leave play in not just shaping productivity, but other aspects of the gendered impact of parenthood. Okay, so in our survey, we asked about this question, and we find is that half of women and about 20% of men said that these leave policies are somewhat or very important for choosing their current faculty job. And our interpretation of this result is that essentially strong leave policies are an underused recruitment and retention tool in the US. Now, I understand that things are a bit different in Europe because there are these national level policies of social safety nets and paid parental leave, but there is still variation at the national level in Europe. And so as a result, if you are a faculty member or a potential faculty member on the market looking for a job, and you have the option of taking a job in France or in Norway, where there are differences in terms of the paid parental leave policies and the support, then that also is a way of shifting people around in the system. And so even in Europe, where there are stronger leave policies, the heterogeneity there still makes it the case that strong leave policies are likely an underused recruitment and retention tool. We also find that among US institutions, as you all may imagine, it's disaster. Only 64% of US institutions have any paid parental leave policy at all. So 36% of them say, good luck, and that's their policy. Of those that have a policy, the average length is about the same, 15 weeks for women, 12 weeks for men. Many institutions in the US have a gender neutral paid parental leave policy in which you essentially get one term off at full pay. But that's where things sort of begin to get messy because most of these policies did not specify whether that relief covers teaching and service and research, or just service, or just teaching, or just research. And moreover, in reading these policies, we found that they are a Byzantine mess. Many of them have shocking requirements like in order for a mother to receive their paid parental leave benefit, they have to obtain a letter from the doctor stating that they are medically disabled as a result of the birth of the child and therefore are unable to complete their faculty duties. So other policies require individuals to negotiate with their unit heads, department chair or dean, in order to receive that leave. And then if the leave is not specified in terms of the structure, they're negotiating on the amount and the type of leave as well. And other research shows that such arrangements in which people are required to negotiate for benefits have a strong gendered effect in which men get larger benefits than women do. Okay, so this is all quite depressing in many ways. We also wanted to ask the question of whether or not things are changing. And this is a question that sometimes is addressed in the literature. Usually it's indicated that things are changing, often in a positive direction. So in our case, we wanted to just divide faculty into two groups and just compare those two groups. So we divided them into faculty who had children prior to 2000 and after 2000. And here we see large differences, in fact, that the differences are shrinking. So gender neutral parental leave policies in the US mostly became available following 2001. There was a policy memo put out by our main university association that recommended gender neutral parental leave. And as a result, since 2000, eligible fathers are using parental leave at nearly twice the rate that they were prior to gender neutral parental leave being available, suggesting that these policies are also affecting males or fathers' behaviors to the point where actually the majority of eligible fathers are now taking parental leave in some capacity. But women still take it far more often. 90% of women who are eligible for paid parental leave in our survey said that they did indeed take paid parental leave. We also find that the productivity gap itself is narrowing across our three fields. So if we divide those curves into the pre and post 2000, the inset here shows the pre-2000 gap emerging, and the outset shows the post-2000 gap. I mean, look at those numbers for computer science. 27 papers difference was the cumulative difference for pre-2000 faculty, whereas it's only 10, only 10 for the post-2000 faculty. So that's still a large gap, but it shrunk considerably. In business, it went from being a 3 to a -1, suggesting that things are pretty even, perhaps, in business. And history, we have no explanation for this weird sort of gap that opens up at the end of years 7, 8, and 9 in history. But we see that nevertheless, the gap is still also shrinking a little bit in history too. So this suggests that as things in terms of the environmental structure, the policies are changing, and perhaps also the norms are changing, that the productivity gap is responding to those, probably because time is the variable that is most important. Okay, so let me wrap up this section of the talk. So we find essentially that using our causal identification strategy, that parenthood can be said to cause the vast majority of the current gender productivity gap. And by vast majority, I mean 86 to 97% of the effect size can be explained by the gendered effect of parenthood. These are my kids in the photos here. Fathers do not systematically get a boost from parental leave, although of course there are individuals who do, who make that choice to publish more papers rather than use the time to take care of the kids. But parental leave is especially important to women. They say this is true as a recruitment and as a retention tool. We also find that it's important for all parents, really. And this is clearly indicated by the fact that fathers are increasingly taking parental leave and that the gender productivity gap is shrinking. Likely there's a relationship there. Only 64% of US institutions offer any paid parental leave, which is a travesty. But we find also that the unequal impact of parenthood really cuts across prestige, that individuals at the highest prestige institutions experience an impact that is proportional to their productivity just as much as the individuals at the low prestige places. Now, there are several caveats to our study, places where we could have done better, or directions for future research. For instance, we did not ask about dual career relationships or statuses. So after the survey, we sort of looked at this data and we thought, oh shoot, like we should have asked about that. And we have a follow-up study that we're doing where we do ask about this factor, but we didn't ask it in a way that would allow us to incorporate into this particular study. This is important because if you have two professors who are raising a child together, that may produce a larger shock to the productivity of one or the other. On the other hand, there's an interesting effect of gender neutral parental leave policies when it comes to productivity for dual career couples in academia, which is both parents would get, at least in the US, the benefit from the university paid parental leave. And so that means that the productivity of women, the mothers, may actually be increased by the presence of gender neutral parental leave, because if the fathers take the leave from the university, which is more generous than most of the leave in industry in the US, which is 0 typically in the US, then that benefits the mother indirectly by allowing the father to take parental duties off the mother's plate for one semester and allow her to be more productive than she would have been normally. So this speaks to another paper that was written some years ago in economics that found that there was a strong negative effect of gender neutral parental leave policies on the tenure rates of women. So we find no evidence that is consistent with their conclusions One of their conclusions was that fathers get a systematic boost in their productivity. We find no evidence for that. And the other was that gender-neutral parental leave policies are damaging to women's careers, and we find no evidence of that either. Our sample is current faculty only, and this is where I think we have a hint about why we see the parents being more productive than their non-parent matches in our data, which is that we may have selected only for those who will experience a smaller productivity penalty, essentially a survivorship bias thing here, in which if you are on the academic track and you know your productivity is relatively low and you want children, you may leave academia because you recognize that you might not be able to do both. And people who choose to have children over an academic career, if they are on the lower end of productivity, that will naturally move the average up. And as a result, the distributions of productivity might not be different, but because of survivorship bias, we see an effect in which future parents are more productive than non-parents even before they become parents. And then finally, I want to point out that productivity is an extremely crude measure of scholarship contributions. We made no effort in order to weight contributions by the impact factor of the journal or the citation count downstream. And we did this in part because those are very subjective evaluations, ones that are best left to scientists as a community to evaluate and not to simple machine counting things. And yet, nevertheless, we still see a very large impact on productivity, which helps us address this large and ancient extant literature about the productivity gap. So the paper was published in Science Advances earlier this year, The Unequal Impact of Parenthood in Academia. I want to thank my co-authors. Dr. Allison Morgan was the lead author on this. She's now a data scientist at Twitter, along with other people in our group, Dr. Sam Wei, who's left a few years ago to go to Spotify, Mike Hofer, who's at Colorado, and then the faculty collaborators, Mirta Galesic, who's at the Santa Fe Institute, and Daniel Larimore, who's also at the University of Colorado. The paper is open access, so you're welcome to read it if you want. And I want to thank our funders who supported this project, which is the National Science Foundation of the US and the Department of Defense through their social science program, the Minerva program. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Aaron. This was